The year is 1998. Emergency systems across the country are transitioning from analog to digital, a complex and often fractured process. In one major municipality, this transition created a terrifying vulnerability, a gap in the bureaucratic defense shield. This vulnerability was not a hacking attempt or a physical break-in. It was a simple, profound bureaucratic oversight concerning dropped or abandoned 911 calls from landlines.
For years, a known serial predator, whom we will refer to only as Subject Delta, operated within this flawed window. His strategy relied entirely on the systemic assumption that silence equaled safety, and that abandoned calls were merely technical static.
We must first understand the infrastructure of the late 90s dispatch. When a 911 call was made and immediately dropped, the system generated a partial log, often displaying only the originating number and address. Crucially, if the dispatcher did not verbally connect with the caller, the established protocol allowed the call record to be relegated to a secondary, non-priority queue, sometimes called the ghost ledger.
The assumption was that these were children playing, dialing errors, or accidental hang-ups. The sheer volume of these abandoned calls overwhelmed the manpower available to follow up on every single instance.
Subject Delta understood this inherent systemic fatigue. His method of operation involved generating an initial, immediate silent call just prior to an attack.
This initial call served two purposes. First, to confirm the phone line was active, and second, to introduce static into the log system, increasing the noise floor before the victim might make a subsequent genuine distress call.
His hunting ground was specific: older residential areas that still predominantly used wired landlines, areas where location data was reliable, but follow-up protocol was the weakest link.
The primary error was simple. If a dispatcher attempted a mandatory callback on an abandoned line and received a busy signal or no answer, that attempt was often considered sufficient due diligence. The true victim was often restrained or incapacitated immediately after attempting to call, rendering the callback ineffective, logging the incident as a benign abandoned signal.
In May 1998, the system failed its first recorded victim in this series, Miss Clara Jenkins. Her distress call lasted exactly 5 seconds, ending abruptly before she could speak a word.
The dispatcher noted the call, attempted a mandatory 3-ring callback, and upon receiving no answer, marked the incident abandoned, location verified, no contact made.
The location was Jenkins' home address, but without vocal confirmation or an open line, the call generated no police response, only a digital file assigned low priority.
The inherent structure meant that multiple abandoned calls, even from the same number, were treated as individual, unconnected statistical noise rather than escalating red flags.
The system lacked a reliable, real-time trigger for address frequency. This was the critical flaw Subject Delta had identified and exploited meticulously. Between May 1998 and February 1999, 6 separate incidents involving 5 victims were recorded in the ghost ledger, all sharing this precise pattern of a near-immediate hang-up and failed callback.
The investigative trail, had it been followed, would have led immediately to the victims' residences, but these crucial data points remain siloed, buried under the daily deluge of 911 traffic.
One chilling entry concerned a third attempt by a victim, Miss Evelyn Reed, who managed to dial 911 twice in 90 seconds, both calls categorized as abandoned.
The first callback yielded a busy signal, indicating the line was in use. The second, 90 seconds later, went unanswered. Protocol stated this indicated the issue had likely resolved.
Subject Delta was banking on this normalization of non-responsive lines. He knew the police would not dispatch unless a definitive threat or open line was confirmed.
The escalating brutality only became apparent when the victims were discovered days later, but even then, the connection back to the 911 logs was indirect, often overlooked.
Detectives investigating the incidents initially focused on traditional evidence, fingerprints, witnesses, forensic pathology, not on systemic dispatch data. It took the tireless effort of one specific data analyst reviewing historical logs for a completely unrelated auditing purpose to notice the eerie commonality. This analyst, whose name remains protected, searched the ghost ledger using location coordinates corresponding to recent crimes, dating back 6 months.
The results were stunning. Every single homicide linked to the serial predator had at least one corresponding abandoned 911 call minutes before the estimated time of attack.
The timing was too precise to be random. The pattern was undeniable, a desperate attempt by the victim to call out, muffled and ignored by a faulty bureaucratic process.
The analyst immediately flagged the data for the Special Investigations Unit. The realization sent immediate shockwaves through the dispatch center and city government.
This was not negligence by individual dispatchers, but a failure of institutional protocol, a decision made years earlier to prioritize audible threats over silent, static data.
The immediate operational directive was issued. Henceforth, any dropped landline call, regardless of the dispatcher's ability to speak to the caller, required a mandatory physical welfare check if the callback failed. However, this change came too late for the previous victims, and the public demanded answers for the systemic oversight that had allowed a killer to operate with impunity. The subsequent investigation led to the formation of the Special Review Committee on Emergency Call Protocol, tasked with dissecting every data point from the last 2 years. The committee identified 127,000 abandoned calls in the ghost ledger during the serial predator's operational period. The challenge was finding the needle in this vast, ignored haystack. The bureaucratic defense presented by the dispatch leadership was that resource limitations made physical follow-up on every dropped call log logistically impossible.
But the counter-argument was strong. The system failed to flag high-frequency, repeat abandoned calls from the same address, which would have required minimal resource dedication.
The system simply reset the priority level for each call, treating a third dropped call from Mrs. Jenkins as functionally identical to a child dialing 911 for the first time across town.
Simultaneously, the active investigation leveraged the geographical specificity of the abandoned call logs to narrow the search for subject Delta. The logs pointed to a small cluster of neighborhoods, suggesting the predator either lived there or operated exclusively within a very tight radius, maximizing his time efficiency.
The breakthrough came not from a new abandoned call, but from identifying the single living victim, Miss Diana Peterson, who had survived an attack months earlier.
Though Peterson had been unable to testify immediately due to trauma, the newly discovered 911 abandoned call log from her home provided a critical validation point. Police cross-referenced Peterson's initial description of the assault vehicle with addresses surrounding the locations of the abandoned calls, finally generating a list of high-value suspects. Subject Delta was ultimately apprehended when he attempted to perform his signature pre-attack abandoned call in a newly designated high-alert zone. The updated protocol, mandating immediate patrol dispatch on any abandoned call in that zone, activated a response team within 2 minutes. He was observed leaving the residence, attempting to flee, and was detained without further incident. The technological loophole had finally been closed. The arrest led to a public reckoning. The subsequent trial of Subject Delta was overshadowed by the inquiry into the institutional failures of the 911 system itself.
The Special Review Committee's final report was damning, emphasizing that human complacency, derived from statistical noise, had overridden essential due diligence.
The core recommendation was the establishment of a centralized, mandatory logging system for all 911 contacts, regardless of duration or outcome. This meant that even a half-second dial tone must generate a traceable, searchable record, eliminating the ghost ledger entirely. Furthermore, the committee mandated the integration of predictive analytics software designed to automatically flag any address generating more than one abandoned call within a 7-day window. This shift acknowledged the predator's strategic use of system noise, requiring the system itself to learn to filter out the intentional static and identify genuine patterns of distress. The most fundamental change concerned the callback policy. If a dispatcher received a busy signal, a mandatory second immediate physical dispatch was required, unless explicit contact was made. The logic was simple. A busy signal on a dropped 911 call suggested the line was still engaged, possibly by the perpetrator or by the victim attempting to use the phone. The missed calls case of 1998 resulted in sweeping changes that transcended municipal boundaries, becoming a national model for enhanced 911 redundancy and data integrity. It spurred federal funding for the modernization of dispatch technology, recognizing that outdated or fragmented systems were existential security risks.
The legacy of Subject Delta is not just the memory of his horrific crimes, but the institutional realization that bureaucracy can unintentionally become an accomplice to violence.
Modern dispatch systems now incorporate sophisticated algorithms that weigh location history, frequency, time of day, and even ambient noise patterns recorded during the brief duration of a dropped call.
These protocols, born from the tragic oversight of the late 90s, ensure that silent calls are no longer dismissed as mere technological noise, but treated as the urgent signals of distress they often are. The cost of this education was tragically high, measured in the lives of those who attempted to reach safety but were silenced by a system that failed to look past the surface data. The missed calls case serves as a permanent analytical reminder. In emergency services, technical perfection is not a luxury, it is the baseline requirement for protecting the public trust.
The legacy of this case remains essential reading for every data scientist and dispatcher working in emergency management today, ensuring that the ghost ledger never claims another victim.
The incident involving Clara Jenkins was particularly illustrative of the systemic error. A neighbor, hours later, reported suspicious activity, but the lack of a preceding police dispatch meant the information wasn't immediately linked.
The initial investigation into Jenkins' disappearance concluded there was no forced entry, suggesting she knew her attacker, a standard profile assumption that derailed the search for several crucial days.
It was only the painstaking work of the internal auditor who later cross-referenced the silent call addresses with property tax records, identifying a potential common vector of the suspect.
The total number of victims confirmed to have made a silent or abandoned call prior to their assault reached 8, highlighting the consistent reliability of Delta's tactical exploitation. The review committee ultimately recommended disciplinary action against several supervisory personnel for failing to monitor the metrics of abandoned calls with sufficient diligence, regardless of protocol. The resulting 911 Redundancy Act emphasized the absolute necessity of multiple verification layers, ensuring that no single technical failure could nullify an emergency request. While technology has advanced significantly since 1998, the core lesson remains. Human interpretation of ambiguous data requires mandatory skepticism, especially when lives are on the line.
Thank you for joining this deep dive into one of true crime's most complex cases of bureaucratic failure. If you found this analysis compelling, don't forget to like and subscribe for more updates on systemic investigations.